All right, welcome, Left Reckoners, to a very special episode. I'm joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David.
And we have returning one of our favorite guests. We might even be able to call honorary. This is a very honorary title in the TMBS universe, Left Reckoning crew. Lillian Cicerchia, who's joining us all the way from Chi-Town this time, and is the author of a really great piece in Jacobin called "Liberal Freedoms Were Won despite not because of capitalism." You can also find Lillian's work at What's Left of Philosophy as well too. How's it going, Lillian?
Good. Thanks for having me. Thanks for reading the article.
Oh, of course. I always appreciate your pieces, especially in these kind of in places like Jacobin too, because I don't know. I feel like you make good interventions of sort of trying to make the left a little bit more serious about these questions, not just taking easy answers. But I was really intrigued by this piece, especially because, this is the debate that I think almost everybody who in America, at least, who has a kind of general notion of what socialism is sort of inundated with this idea that socialism might be nice because you get, better wages and maybe some nice social programs, but you also lose your personal and individual freedoms. And too often, I think people on the left and socialists even are very willing to actually entertain this argument and sort of say like, oh, what we're wanting to do is something different from the tradition. And we're going to do some kind of synthesis of like liberalism and socialism. But you make the argument in this piece that a lot of those views are pretty mistaken. Could you sort of set the stage for us a little bit about, why you wrote this piece, and also, the kind of common misunderstanding of socialism and communism as being a system that's very much against like kind of individual or like what we call liberal freedoms?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to do is just give a shout out to Igor Shoikhebrod, who wrote the book I was reviewing called Revisiting Marx's Critique of Liberalism. And he just a mild amount of biographical info is that he's from Tajikistan and he was born in the former USSR. And like interestingly sort of encountered, from what I understand, Western Marxists who were really insistent on this idea that Marx was against liberalism or didn't have a theory of rights, or thought that rights were like intrinsically bourgeois or capitalist ideals. And what I take to be a part of the motivation is just to do a deep dive into Marx and to seeing whether or not that's true. So a large part of the book is like, what we often call Marxology. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are like some stakes that are worth fleshing out, because the reason I bring up the small biographical point is simply that I think on the Western left, this kind of rejoinder to say that this interpretation of Marx himself is mistaken is a really helpful corrective, because it's just true that the Western left tends to assume that. Marx was in some way like, only saw liberal rights as a mystification of relations of domination, or like justifying capitalist class power. And they can do that, like that is a part of what liberal rights do. They protect private property. They are biased in favor of the rich and against the poor. And I think that if you have a Marxist analysis, you understand that the state as a whole has a class bias against the poor. And so like there is a kernel of truth to that in a sense, under capitalism, rights can justify domination. But that's just not the only part of the story. Like part of what made capitalism livable is that working people exploited political openings to be able to civilize that system. And I think people tend to, like the things that we value, I just mean we in the most general sense, civil liberties, the right to organize your workplace, anti-discrimination laws, however like effective or real those things are, I don't think those are things that I don't think people actually want to do away with them, or think that they're trivial. So there's this always like contradiction in the way Marxists talk about this stuff. On the one hand, it's just bourgeois rights. On the other hand, we defend civil liberties. So it's at some point you have to kind of confront the fact that like it's not just domination. These are valuable things, genuinely. And it's not to. And I think the further point I wanted to make was simply that like this is not to capital's credit. Like they don't deserve, and the system doesn't deserve credit for civilizing itself. Like it's not a march to moral and legal progress. Like working people made the system more hospitable to human life, and I think that's like a W we should claim. But
yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to hear you expand on that a little bit more, because I think like the way a lot of like, especially like left liberals try to present capitalism is like, oh, well, it's excessive at times, but wherever it's entered into a society, it has come with it this kind of expansion of liberal and individual rights, because those are a necessity for like market relations. I mean, how would you respond to that kind of, perspective?
I think it's just obviously false. I think that capitalism clearly coexists with various political regimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't say this lightly. I do think that is a sort of, it is a Eurocentric way of thinking, because you kind of think that like, because there are some liberal democracies that emerged, that the natural process of modernization is going to be that everywhere becomes a liberal democracy, and that is intrinsically good. The problem is that it's not just false because it's kind of focused on an ideal narrative in Europe. It's also just false about Europe. Like that's not what happened, and that was a part of my argument. And I think that if you take just a brief survey of countries around the world that are subject to the dominant market imperatives of the capitalist economy, it's just not true that democracy is inevitable. I think what is true, and what I'm willing to concede, is that capitalism as a social form creates some political openings, and it is possible to exploit those and for working people to make it better. But it's just not inevitable, and that's why I think it's important to say that it's not to the system's credit. That doesn't just happen because the system is benign or virtuous or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I would also add too, it's like that kind of understanding of history. I know I'm going to be, the Marxist here, but it says like it really lacks a kind of class analysis, as if like these things weren't happening through kind of prolonged struggle. Look at in the American case. I mean, most people are probably familiar. You have the ideals that are written on the paper and then the reality, and it takes massive movements of people to end up, getting those rights and privileges and even the right to vote, to not even recognize in their fullness, but at least in some capacity, like was the result of actual struggle within this country, and not just something that was a natural kind of input-output result of, a free market system.
Yeah, I mean, one way of like, it kind of depends who you're talking to. Like that, like I think that liberals think that, and then I think that the problem with people on the Marxist left is that there's some just contradictory ideas. So on the one hand, it's like the class struggle is somehow inevitable, but like the idea that political rights and civil liberties are kind of the inevitable outgrowth of the system itself. And that's what makes them bourgeois. But like, if that were true, then the class struggle is not necessary. So, I don't think you can have it both ways. And in the past, the way that this was understood as, a teleological development to history, that there was kind of a natural, like an inherent direction. And I think that I'm just more skeptical of that than Marxists in the past have been. But it is definitely a contrasting view to the one that you're talking about, where people say that like the idea that there is a kind of linear progress just in terms of, we give people more freedoms, that we allow them to make individual choices, we take them out of these traditional contexts, and then we give them, and then the market seems to do that, and therefore political rights follow, but I just don't think they do follow. I mean, like we're talking today about the way that people, like the entire legal system and the Supreme Court is basically designed to suppress labor and make organizing your workplace difficult. If it were true that there was just like a linear march to progress, this would have been a problem that was solved in the 30s, and now it's just as difficult as it ever was to win a contract. So anyway.
Can you touch a little bit more on Marx and whether he subscribed to this sort of progressive capitalism? You touch on it in your piece.
I think Marx kind of did. I think that he sort of thought that he thought in terms of like a whole social form. So like you have this system of commodity exchange and market competition, and I think that he really thought that there was kind of a legal form that emerges to become suitable for that. In my opinion, there is some relationship there, like capitalist societies in general protect private property rights and so on and so forth. But that's not the same thing as thinking that like liberalism is like the inherent outgrowth of it, like in the terms of the political rights and the civil liberties that one actually finds important. And I think that that's usually like a sleight of hand. Like you can have a political system that protects private property rights in favor of the rich, and it doesn't need to be one that guarantees civil liberties for universally. And I think that if Marx was probably wrong about something, it was in assuming that kind of inherent progress. So yeah, I don't have that much more on Marx.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to say that big man maybe messed up a little.
And I feel like maybe the context, and like I'm not the perfect expert on sort of 19th century history, but like feudalism wasn't as far in the rear view back when he was writing. Like it was literally like coming after him. So I feel like it's a little bit more understandable in that context, like, or at least that's the context it needs to be understood in.
Oh, totally. I think you're right about that. Like these were like the kind of like political fights for like political freedom were like such cataclysmic fights that were very different from what people only a few generations previously had experienced. Marx didn't get a lot of time to like see how the capitalist state would develop even in Europe or globally, and so I think that it made sense for him at the time to see a sort of modernization narrative as attached to liberalism itself. But I don't think that he had a lot of like, I think the longue durée of history would have made him doubt the premise. It did make sense at the time.
I mean, I'll have a few other things I want to get to, but just since we're on Marx too, I mean, just so people, because I think people who are going to be listening to this might be coming from all different places. So I just want to sort of make this clear for folks. Despite, some of the things that, some people sort of focus on with Marx criticizing, I don't know. I don't want to jump too far ahead to talking a little bit about Lenin and like formal freedoms and that kind of stuff. But, Marx makes these criticisms of like, the kind of liberal state and liberal rights and makes the argument that like, these aren't actually properly enjoyed, right? This kind of neutrality that is being presented is missing the forms of domination of like capital society. But that being said, and you've mentioned this, but I'd just like to re-up it one more time, Marx at his time was somebody who was a fierce advocate of these kind of things that we would call civil liberties, freedom of speech, etc.
Yeah, I mean, if they were merely formal, he wouldn't have felt that strongly that working class people needed them. So that's, I think, what the best way to understand what Marx usually means by talking about just merely formal rights versus substantive rights. First of all, in the book, Igor discusses quite a bit the different language Marx uses to make these distinctions. In the German word for right can imply both just kind of an objective formal right or a subjective, more substantively enjoyed right, or even like the whole conception of justice that we all share together. So in the German word for right, there's like built in all these little distinctions that in English tends to, I think, get lost, because when we think of right, we just think about, the right to free speech or the right to, the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights. That's what we think about. And Marx had a more like varied understanding of it, and it encompassed several different concepts. So for him, it wasn't like contradictory to say, on the one hand, that formal rights had a very like, were backed by conditions of domination, and therefore they are contradictory in nature and incomplete. Like you can't enjoy formal freedoms substantively if domination is undermining the basis of those freedoms. Like that's what Marx thought was happening. At the same time, it doesn't mean that they're not real. Like, I mean, the idea that like that political freedoms are somehow superficial because incomplete or partial or contradictory, like superficiality and like contradictoriness are not the same. I think.
No, and I mean, just because I'm curious what your thoughts are on this too, because I think apart from Marx, like Lenin and his legacy and his intervention on these things, I think sits especially on a lot of the people on like the Western Marxist left. He's on their mind, and for people who aren't familiar, Lenin makes similar kinds of arguments about like formal freedoms and actual freedoms. I'm paraphrasing, but he has, lines where he says things like, freedom of speech, what you actually mean is like freedom of millionaires to own the newspapers. Freedom of labor, you mean freedom of the capitalist class to exploit like the workers, right? And people see those arguments, and I think, frankly, a lot of what Lenin was talking about was very true in that context and time. And a lot of people see that as a kind of rejection of those concepts in their whole, rather than Lenin making the point that what people were arguing for, what people were appealing for him to do, was basically to, empower, a bourgeoisie, class of bourgeoisie within Russia, so that they could use, openings to their advantage. But I'm curious what you think about that kind of development later, because I think it really does sit, especially in America, on people's minds when they're thinking about, liberal freedoms, individual freedoms, and communism or socialism.
I think I was pretty solidly convinced by Lars Lee's analysis of this. The kind of he wrote this very absurdly long book. That was like 500 pages, and I finally got through it because in the argument is basically, it's like a revisionist idea of what Lenin was about. Is that Lenin was really like defending a model of democratic working class political organization on a German social democratic model, not social democracy like we know it today. Like the revolutionary left used to also be called social democrats. And he was positively obsessed with the abolition of the monarchy in Russia, and he was obsessed with political freedom. And he thought that like the first task of the workers' movement was political freedom. And he had a way of trying to attain political freedom that was distinct to the working class movement. So I don't think that, Lenin just thought these were just bourgeois formalities. I think that he thought there was like an intrinsic good to political freedom, that workers needed it, and that workers couldn't organize themselves to attain, social power and like overthrow capitalism if they didn't have it. So I don't know. I think that Lenin was more of a Democrat in those like early years than is normally understood, and I think that's perfectly compatible with a really deep critique of the capitalist state. I think both things are true. And what I'd ask people to consider, if you are kind of hostile to the idea that like bourgeois rights are meaningful or whatever, just consider, like, do you want to live in like an illiberal society? Like I've said this before on What's Left of Philosophy, but when you think about it seriously, what kind of society do you want to live in? And the answer is not going to be one. It might not be liberal, because liberal is like something that is suitable to a particular social form, but it's not going to be a society that is illiberal. Like the things that you value about your civil liberties and freedoms now, you don't want to live in a society that doesn't have those things. That's a very counterintuitive claim, and it's not what most people actually believe. And the problem is that people tend to gesture at the future world as this kind of unspecified thing that is like going beyond all of that. Like we're just going to get it right. And I think that that's not true. I think like there are things that are valuable. We should understand what a basis for them would be, a material basis for them would be in an economy that is more egalitarian. And we want to have a society that like has a conception of justice and rights, and it's just going to take a different shape. And like, I don't know what that looks like, but that's what we should be trying to figure out. We shouldn't be arguing with people that these things don't matter, that we want a society that's like illiberal. That's people are right to like think that's not a good idea.
Yeah, you have a good line here. It ignores those for whom liberal rights are truly valuable, workers who wage the political battles for their expansion and whose commitment to these rights move capitalism in the direction of democracy. I feel like, you're basically granting liberal capitalism ownership over things that were won with blood and struggle, like of liberation movements.
Yeah, and I had somebody, ask me why this point matters of like who won the rights, because I think that one problem on the Western left, and Leah Yippie pointed this out to me as well, which is that we make these grand critiques of liberalism, and yet we don't actually believe what we say. The fact that we implicitly do value all of these things in liberal freedoms, and we know that they're important for minority groups and for workers, and yet we just like thunder on about liberal rights being in some way superficial, it means that we're not really that hostile to like the social form as it is. We actually give it quite a lot of credit, and we're kind of comfortable in it. And I think that that's really the wrong perspective. Like capitalism is capable of rolling back, like the political system is capable of rolling back rights. It's clearly capable of retrenchment. It's capable of authoritarianism. And its tendency to do those things is a problem. And you're not going to see that as a problem and as intrinsically objectionable as a form of domination if you continue to think that it's like the thing that gives you all these rights and that you implicitly enjoy and support. And so I think it makes the critique of capitalism a lot weaker if it gets to like the liberal agent. I just don't think it is. So,
yeah.
Well, let's pull this up real quick, because I think this quote from your piece is pretty strong in sort of getting us to this next bit. This is from Lillian's piece in Jacobin. What distinguishes socialist politics from bourgeois politics, in essence, liberalism, is not a difference in kind, but in perspective. Liberal politics manages domination. Socialist politics seeks to abolish it. As a result, the socialist perspective is not intrinsically extra-legal or beyond justice. Rather, its strategies and priorities derive their moral legitimacy from an ideal of human freedom beyond domination. I mean, could you help us understand this here? Most importantly, the difference between the perspective here when it comes to these kind of freedoms and rights.
So I think one, it might be helpful to like have a little contrast in your mind of, so like think about the debate about like civil disobedience. Okay? So like a lot of the legitimacy of civil disobedience, so what Martin Luther King is famous for, nonviolent strategies of resisting the law because the law itself is unjust. What is being appealed to is an idea of justice that is beyond the current legal confines of the law. Of course, the idea of the law is supposed to kind of embody a common sense or a public conception of justice, but it's not justice itself. Like it's subject to critique from if it's masking or not adequately addressing relations of domination, then we can critique that and we should change the law. Because the point of the law is to secure public freedom, individual liberties, and so on. So that's tends to be our intuition about civil disobedience. If you're on the left, or if you were even taught in grammar school about what was good about the civil rights movement, even the sanitized versions of it that you get taught. If you notice, when we have debates about civil disobedience now, we're constantly debating about whether it's almost never legitimate while it's happening, because what's under discussion is whether or not the law that it's opposing is in fact unjust. So there's always a kind of low-key debate about whether or not civil disobedience is justified, because it's not apparent to people that the law is unjust. There's always this excess, okay? And I would say that the socialist perspective is always looking for that excess. It's never assuming that the law is intrinsically just. It's always looking at the social relations and whether or not the law is adequately reflecting the right moral position or the right legal position or the right political position on the relations of domination. So if what it needs to happen, you break the law to change it, then that's what has to happen. Liberals tend to think strictly in terms of political legitimacy. Okay, so what do we all agree on? What is the status quo reasonable? And then it's very difficult to push them to no, this isn't reason. This is not legitimate because there's some higher criteria by which that is creating an injustice. And I think that liberals basically seek to kind of manage a civil society, the state, kind of competing interests by seeking an equilibrium. It's not a calling regarding a higher, it doesn't respond to higher criteria. And that makes liberalism intrinsically contradictory, because it's very difficult to appeal to that if the basis of legitimacy is the law and the political system. And I think socialists, just because we see the whole social form, it's not just about the political system, it's not just about the law. We see that the law is a complex relationship with actual social relationships. We think about the normative criteria of justice as more in terms of the totality. And if that is unjust, then it's not possible for the law to be completely just. And so there's a higher standard here that's what I think. I think it's a higher standard. That's what socialist politics should be responding to. But that doesn't mean you have to break the law or that we're talking about getting rid of the law. It just means you're not trapped by it. You're not trapped by the system of rights as it is. You are critically reflecting on it. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that paints it very well. And I'm curious what you think about this, but this is an argument that I would make to somebody if I was hanging out with them at a bar, talking about politics and socialism, to somebody who might not be, follow it, but might consider themselves to be somebody who they like ideas of individual freedom. I mean a lot of guys like that here, and oftentimes, no, yeah. You'd be surprised how many I convince that. But I make the point to them a lot. It's you like these concepts like freedom of speech and equality under the law, but look at where the check is on that. Look where that space ends, right? Private power, corporate power, your freedom of speech is over there. Equality before the law. I'll tell you right now, if most of us were to be charged with something or have to face our legal system, the immediate hurdle that you face is the ability to afford, some kind of legal representation. And yes, our system does allow for us to get somebody provided by the state to protect us. But look at how underfunded that is in actuality. right? Where you have somebody who has 500 cases and they basically just take the best plea deal that they can get because materially that right is not supported by the state, right? So it's like there's the huge difference between, I mean, this is getting to formal and actual freedom stuff, but like there's a huge difference between the, you know, the stated things, which I think like, I will say this, and I know, you know, privately some of us have talked about this. Like, I do get frustrated when you see socialists and leftists, especially online, like acting like standing up for these freedoms in like the abstract and saying, I want to live in a society where we have, you know, the freedom to express ourselves. I want to live in a society where if I'm charged with something, I have these kind of protections. I want to live in a society of equality under the law.
You're being
like
cringe
that's
now,
cringe. And because so many people think that that's a kind of celebration of the current and the status quo rather than something that is beyond the possibility of the current, you know, liberal capitalist state, because you couldn't have you know, kind of personal freedoms in the workplace because the workplace is a dictatorship of the boss, right? Like they have to be in charge there, or that entire model doesn't work. You know, and being able to point that out and say that like, no, these ideals that are attractive to the vast majority of people are something that we should be upholding and can use politically to our advantage to say, look, it's this very system that is imposed upon us, which is restricting those, you know, freedoms that it's supposed to be protecting or providing to us.
I think that the criminal justice system, the issue of public defenders is kind of an interesting example. So think about like both sides of the equation. Like public defenders are underpaid, very underpaid, and overworked. And the people who retain their services are going to be underserved inevitably, not always because of a low quality lawyer, but because it's not possible to give people the time and attention that they deserve. On the other hand, there are some things about the criminal justice system that are potentially like very pro-worker or pro-poor person, which is that the state in the U.S. has a very high burden of proof. Like, you know, like the fact that you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody committed a crime. In theory, this is a very high burden of proof. And other countries don't even have that high of a burden of proof. When I look at this, I think whatever like system exists in another society, I'm not sure that that's like intrinsically bad. I don't think the state should have a low burden of proof. You know, so there's a, you know, I think the state should have to prove itself to the public and to you that like this is the truth of the matter, because I'm not sure that they should have the power to, you know, so in theory, you can imagine something like that being useful, but you can see the contradiction. It doesn't work that way in practice. And instead we have, you know, this insane, you know, crime against humanity that is mass incarceration. But our discourse is very like confused about it because there are these things that people do actually implicitly support, and yet they are betrayed in principle. So we have these expectations and they are betrayed. And I think that the point that socialists should be making is not that something like having a high burden of proof is wrong. We should be saying that the state can very easily meet this burden of proof because of the substantive inequality and the reasons that people are committing crimes. And we should be arguing that there should be less of that altogether, and so on and so forth. So the point is like, a Marxist argument tries to get to the root of the problem, which is that the contradiction is intrinsic to the form of society. Not that everything that could be desirable needs to go away, or we should do away with the things that could be reformatted or rethought and done otherwise. Not everything, you know, because something like a high burden of proof is actually something that's the product of previous fights. And it's just incumbent upon us to like think about freedom as something real. Otherwise, it's not worth fighting for. And I'm not sure what we're saying to people about, you know, you want criminal justice reform? What if we told you that if you reformed it, that's not real? Like, doesn't make sense. So we have to be the people that are like that are saying, yes, we want more freedoms. Yes, we want the state to have a higher burden of proof. Yes, we want better quality, this and that. But we know that this is not going to go far enough because the system produces the all of these reasons why it doesn't work. You know, so like we need to be the people that say we want more and not less. That's always my that's always my moral position on what socialists should be doing. We want more and not less. You don't want people to give anyone the impression that you want less civil liberties. We want more of those things, always.
Yeah, I mean, I think that puts it well. I mean, I really appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon and breaking this down. I'm sure there's a hell of a lot more that we can get to in the future. People should definitely check out Lillian's work in Jacobin, and also be sure to not just listen, but sub up on Patreon to the podcast, What's Left of Philosophy.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of What's Left of Philosophy. You guys have a really good sort of dynamic there, especially because I'm not as philosophically minded as either Lillian or David, but I can listen to podcasts. And I remember listening years ago to one called Philosophy Bites, and it got me some decent exposure to ideas. But you guys all having a leftist perspective on things, walking through things like Thomas More's Utopia, it's very engaging. And Lillian will come up and be like, "Can I torch this guy," or something like that, and it's very conversational and fun to listen to. So I highly recommend the show.
Oh, thank you guys. I mean, we actually discussed if people want to keep an eye out when there was all this liberalism discourse happening on the internet. We thought we might do a series eventually on liberalism, so people could stay tuned and get all of the hot takes.
Oh, perfect. Looking forward to that. All right. Well, Lillian, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.